I have a deeply unsettling story to share, one that begins with my mother's fiancé taking the $7,000 I had painstakingly saved for college, and my mother telling me to keep quiet. In that moment, I felt so powerless and betrayed that I decided I had no choice but to call the police on them. From that single, desperate decision, I discovered something so huge I could hardly believe it. My father had left me a considerable inheritance, and my extended family, every single one of them, had apparently been benefiting from this money while keeping me in the dark. As a result of my call to the authorities, both my mother and her fiancé ended up being arrested, and my maternal grandparents have turned aggressively against me, filling me with confusion and despair. It all started because I involved the police to hold my mother and her partner responsible for their outright theft. But I knew I had strong reasons, valid reasons, to do that. The truth is, my mother and I had never been close, especially not since my father passed away 10 years ago. I am currently 17, and in just a handful of months, I'm supposed to start my college journey. Deep down, I always suspected my mother would never bother setting aside any money to help me with my education, which is exactly why I made up my mind to be financially independent and arrange everything on my own. I began working at 14, taking on part-time gigs right after school, and I have been diligently saving everything I could during the last 4 years so I would at least have some small fund by the time I reached college age. Sometimes, I received monetary gifts from various relatives on birthdays or around the holidays, and I faithfully placed that money into my stash as well. It was gratifying to see that it had grown to nearly $7,000 by the time I turned 17, a sum that, while modest, felt like a lifeline. It was all kept in cash, hidden safely in a small wooden box that my dad had lovingly carved for me, tucked away in a corner of my closet where I believed no one would find it. I never had a bank account, my mother outright forbade it, so it seemed my only option was to guard the money myself. Still, I was careful never to mention that I had any savings to anyone in the house, so I have no idea how it was discovered. One day, I opened that little box and found it completely empty. Panicking, I rushed to my mother, who casually informed me that her fiancé, who I'll refer to as Rob, had used the money for some investment in his new home. I remember the feeling of my entire body seizing in anger when I realized they had literally stolen my entire fund, my lifeline for college. A ferocious argument tore through the house, me against Mom and Rob. But at the end of the day, I'm just a 17-year-old with no power, so I ended up in tears, locked in my bedroom, wondering how they could so easily take 4 years of my work away from me. Once I cried myself hoarse, I felt this resolute sense of determination. I promised myself that I would find a way to make them pay for what they had done. This was too big of a betrayal to go unanswered. In an unexpected stroke of luck or perhaps fate, I managed to get my payback a mere 3 days later. Their criminal behavior led to their arrests, and now they are facing the legal consequences of what they've done. Unfortunately, though, I have become the object of my maternal grandparents' wrath. They are infuriated that their daughter and soon-to-be son-in-law have been thrown behind bars and appear to have lost any compassion they used to display for me. I realize none of this seems to make sense, especially since they have always positioned themselves as my allies before, but life took this cruel turn in a heartbeat. Now, looking back, my tumultuous relationship with my mom grew increasingly strained after my dad's death, and it only intensified the moment Rob wormed his way into our lives. He has been in my orbit for 2 years, and I have despised every second of it because he is genuinely one of the worst human beings I've encountered. He's not typically violent in a physical sense, but he can be psychologically destructive. He hurls curses around with no restraint and targets both my mother and me with insults and verbal aggressions. He savors picking fights, tries everything possible to get a rise out of me, and then yells even more if I stay quiet or show no reaction. My mother either chooses not to see his cruelty or doesn't care enough to defend me. Instead, she usually ends up bearing the brunt of it herself. She met Rob a while after my dad passed. In the first few months, he maintained a friendly facade, but that dissolved once they had their first major quarrel. About 6 months into their relationship, Rob had my mom so thoroughly manipulated that she let him move in with us. He was a no-good fool who jumped from one job to the next, never having enough money to support himself. He's in his mid to late 30s, occasionally taking financial handouts from his own parents because he can't manage his funds and spends more than he earns. Whenever he's at odds with my mom, he hits up his parents for money, and whenever there isn't a fight, he coasts by on whatever he can siphon from her earnings. The sad reality is, my mother isn't wealthy and certainly can't bankroll a partner's extravagant ambitions. She's a floor supervisor at our local supermarket, an honest job that pays a decent wage, but nowhere near enough to fund Rob's ridiculous lifestyle. Thankfully, I was almost entirely self-reliant by that point. Aside from the basics, food and shelter, I didn't ask my mother to get me anything, even after I turned 14 and took on part-time jobs. It was futile to expect even a shred of assistance or kindness from her, as she made it painfully obvious she wasn't interested in doing me any favors. For as long as I can remember, she has treated me with tangible indifference, giving me the impression she never wanted me in the first place. While my father was alive, he was like a buffer, my shield. Whenever Mom lashed out, Dad would step in and protect me, or at least make sure the fury didn't escalate to extremes. But once he died a decade ago, it felt like I was left to fend for myself, which only got worse once Rob entered the picture. My one consolation was the dream that I would soon be at college, away from them both, free at last. But after my funds were seized, those plans seemed to be in serious jeopardy. For 3 days following the disappearance of my cash, I locked myself away in my room, consumed by misery and fighting off waves of hopelessness. The day after the theft, we moved into our brand new house, and while I did my part hauling boxes and helping out, I refused to speak to my mother or Rob. Neither seemed bothered by my stony silence. On the third day, my mother told me to get dressed that evening for a housewarming party. Hearing her breezy tone, I exploded, yelling that I wouldn't comply with her request after they used my hard-earned money to close the deal on the very house they were celebrating. She flew into a rage as well, telling me to suck it up and that I should be happy we finally had a place of our own, one where we wouldn't need to scrape by for rent every month. She lectured me about how I owed her for the rest of my life because she'd raised me, which I thought was ridiculous. Raising me was her legal and moral obligation, and she didn't even do it with any affection. And this house was unnecessarily large for just the three of us. They only purchased it to flaunt their fancy address and newly acquired living space. That confrontation was the last straw, so in my desperation, I picked up the phone and contacted my paternal grandparents, my father's mother and father. It was complicated because they distanced themselves from my mother and me after Dad died, presumably because it was too painful for them to maintain a relationship. I'm not entirely sure why they severed ties, but it had been several years of zero contact, though I still had their numbers saved. I initially considered calling my maternal grandparents for support, but they had shrugged off my plea when my money first disappeared, claiming they were happy that my mother and Rob were finally buying a home, and that I should just look on the bright side. I had always thought they sympathized with me, but their sudden change of attitude enraged and alienated me further. So instead, I contacted my paternal grandparents on a hunch, hoping someone else in my family would actually listen and care. Miraculously, they picked up right away, and I unleashed the whole story: theft, heartbreak, everything. I reminded them that if my father were alive, he would have intervened in a heartbeat. They listened carefully, and then my grandfather dropped an unexpected bomb. My dad had apparently left a substantial college fund for me, meaning there was supposed to be money earmarked for my education. So my grandfather couldn't fathom why I'd been compelled to save on my own. This revelation made my head spin. My mother had never mentioned any such thing. I was in disbelief that my father, knowing his health was failing, had tried to ensure my future was secure, but I had been living under the impression that I was on my own. I asked my grandparents if they had physical evidence I could use to confirm this. They promised to rummage through their records and call me back. In the meantime, I paced around my bedroom, stewing in anger and trying to connect the dots. If my father had indeed left money behind for my education, there was only one plausible reason I'd never heard about it: my mother and Rob must have spirited it away, probably to fund their own lavish purchase. I was certain my mother's salary wouldn't stretch enough to buy a property, and Rob didn't even have stable employment. He had been jobless for 3 months straight. How could they have possibly afforded a new house if not by using a large sum that wasn't theirs to begin with? Finally, my grandparents reached out with digital copies of documents, actual legal forms, that detailed how my mother had promised to use whatever money Dad left behind to pay my tuition and guarantee I had a comfortable life. Reading through those lines, I could only shake my head and marvel at the irony. My mother had done everything possible to make me miserable, when she was legally bound and morally obligated to do the complete opposite. Furious with my grandparents for neglecting to mention these papers sooner, I pressed them for an explanation. They admitted that after my father passed, they had been too distraught to keep track of anything and had grown older and more forgetful, and by the time I was mature enough to understand, we were no longer on speaking terms. Their excuse felt weak, but I was too exhausted and enraged to argue. Determined to stand up for myself, I reached out to a close friend whose father is a police officer. I told him my entire situation, from my stolen college fund to the betrayal by my mother, and begged for assistance. It just so happened that my friend's father also knew a lawyer. Later that same day, in the midst of the housewarming bash, while guests milled around admiring the place, my friend's father, another officer, and the attorney arrived to arrest my mother and Rob. Since Mom had blatantly violated the legal terms of the agreement, she opened herself up to a lawsuit. She had, quite literally, breached her obligations. As the police led her and Rob away in handcuffs, I explained to everyone in attendance exactly why this was happening. Most of the guests were mortified and disgusted. The two criminals I once called family glared at me like I was a traitor, refusing to acknowledge their own wrongdoing. Their plan to dazzle acquaintances and past co-workers with their fancy new abode fizzled out in the most spectacular way possible. My maternal grandparents were also at the party, and they were furious to see their daughter hauled off. Once everyone left, I suddenly realized I was alone in this massive house, uncertain of what to do or where I would go. A somber dread sank in. I knew perfectly well that Mom and Rob would likely be released on bail in no time, and even if I pursued charges, I had no guarantee of victory in a lengthy, complex legal battle. Meanwhile, I wouldn't have immediate access to the money they'd taken from me or the larger inheritance fund I'd just learned about. I couldn't legally put the house on the market because I had no legal claim to it. Rob's and Mom's names were on the deed, not mine, and forcing them to sell could drag out painfully in court. My friend and his father had offered me unwavering support, including help with legal costs, and I was beyond grateful for that. But the entire emotional toll was staggering. Even worse, my maternal grandparents made it known they wanted nothing to do with me now. They called me ungrateful, implying that calling the cops on my mother was an unacceptable betrayal. They insisted I had misunderstood all that Mom did for me, which felt so absurd I hardly had the energy to argue back. But their rejection still hurt, because it left me feeling completely alone in the world. Sure, I'd managed to score one small victory, actually watching them get arrested. But it might have cost me my extended family, leaving me adrift and uncertain if I could ever rebuild my life the way I had hoped. Right now, I can't make sense of what else I could have done, and part of me wonders if I made the right call. But then again, I was simply defending myself against a pair of people who had robbed me and planned to keep doing it. I don't know if it truly makes me a bad person, or if it's just the reality of protecting my future in a house full of people who wouldn't. I feel hopeless and afraid, unsure if I can trust anyone or if there's any future left for me that doesn't involve legal entanglements. Still, I believe justice will be on my side, even if the path is chaotic and lonely. Since then, I've questioned if I'm the bad one for pressing charges. Should I have just let it go for the sake of having some semblance of family support? Then I remember that they drained my savings, money I bled for over several years. That's enough to remind me that I made the only choice that felt right. Anyway, moving on, about a week after I handed them over to the police, they were released from custody, which was anticipated. The moment they returned to the new house we had all moved into together, though it was obviously theirs in name, not mine, I was prepared and quickly slipped out. I had spent the last few days secretly boxing up my belongings because I wanted no confrontation. They walked in, looking haggard but still defiant, and as soon as I heard the door open, I grabbed my things and fled before they could corner me. They shouted for me to stop, to talk, but I ignored them, heading straight to the cab I had prearranged to pick me up. I had been staying at a good friend's place ever since, the same friend whose father took my case seriously and arranged for a lawyer. Every single day, we sit together with the attorney, poring over possibilities, aiming to resolve this nightmare as swiftly as we can. I'm hoping for a quick settlement, even though I'm wary. I have already set up a meeting with their lawyer, Rob and my mother, and a court-appointed mediator in a couple of days. We'll gather around a table and see if we can negotiate some reasonable outcome. If they refuse to find a fair compromise, we'll be forced to push on and let the courts decide. I can't even guess how long that might drag on. I'm keeping my demands simple. I want the financial resources to go to college, just as my father intended. My friend's dad has been wonderful about offering me financial support in the meantime, but I feel extremely uneasy about taking money from people who aren't related to me. It feels awkward accepting more than moral support, even if they are doing it with kindness and empathy. Not surprisingly, I haven't heard a single word from my grandparents, either on my mom's side or my father's side. My dad's parents severed contact the moment they handed me those documents, and my mother's parents have voiced nothing but contempt, refusing to speak to me at all. The last time I went over to my father's parents' house to collect physical copies of everything, they were cold, just wishing me luck before closing the door. They didn't invite me in or show any inclination to talk about the situation. The entire thing feels surreal because it seemed like they had a fleeting bout of guilt when they gave me the evidence I needed, but it never translated to genuine concern for my welfare. So I'm stuck here, disappointed, resentful, and trying to stay focused on my one goal, getting to college. That distant objective is the only thing fueling my spirit these days. I have no biological family to lean on, but my friends have stepped up as an incredible support system. Without them, I'd really be adrift. The tension escalated dramatically just before the mediation was scheduled to take place. A couple of days prior to our upcoming negotiation, my mother managed to contact me through a brand new email address. I had blocked her phone number and personal email, so it was the only method she had to reach me. The message she sent turned my world on its head in a single blow. She basically exposed the entire family, revealing how they had all been conspiring behind my back since I was barely a teenager. While part of me doubted her intentions, she can be manipulative, she also provided snapshots of emails that looked very real. Reading them, I felt physically sick. Apparently, there had been a larger inheritance than even I realized, and more people had their hands in the pot. My father's parents, my mother's parents, even my father's lawyer, all of them took slices of my inheritance, dividing it among themselves when I was around 14 or 15. My mother had forced them to keep quiet by promising them a share and reminding them they could lose access if they didn't play along. Suddenly, all the puzzling behavior from my grandparents came into hideous focus. My maternal grandparents, who seemed so ambivalent when I first complained about my savings being stolen, had actually shared in that stolen inheritance. No wonder they seemed more offended by my reporting my mother to the cops than outraged by her theft. And it also explained my paternal grandparents' guilt and why, once they provided those legal documents, they backed off and avoided further contact. They were trying to atone, but also trying to dodge any direct responsibility. My mother even had digital proof of the times they had all emailed one another, orchestrating how they'd hide these details from me. Evidently, my mother's motivation for sharing this newly damning information was to drag everyone else down with her. She hated that she was the only one facing arrest and legal repercussions when everyone else was just as guilty. Through it all, though, my heart feels broken. Even my dad's own parents did this to me, my father's parents, the ones whose blood I share. That's the worst betrayal. I simply can't fathom that they could stomach using money that was meant for me. Apparently, they'd had a plan to come clean sooner, but my maternal grandparents convinced them it was in nobody's best interest for me to discover the entire truth. At last, they begun feeling remorseful, so when I finally called them, they decided to come forward because they realized it was only right. Still, the entire thing is so painful that I can barely breathe when I think about it. Right now, I'm not sure if I can even articulate what I'm feeling to my closest friends. There is a swirl of fury, heartache, and disbelief raging inside me. Yet, I also know I must bring this up with my lawyer. This new revelation changes everything. My mother, in trying to save herself, has inadvertently spilled the beans on how massive and collaborative their deception was. I do acknowledge, in a twisted way, that if she hadn't told me the truth, I might never have known the full scope of their scheme. At least now I'm aware that I have very few people I can ever truly trust. I'm going to share everything with my friend, who will relay it to his dad, and hopefully, our lawyer can figure out how to proceed. Despite being torn to shreds emotionally, I remain steadfast on one thing: I will start college this year, no matter what I have to do. Even if I have to ask my friend's father to co-sign on a loan, I will not be cheated out of this. My determination is all that's keeping me grounded. Finally, the day arrived for our meeting with the mediator. I walked into that room still reeling from what I discovered. And I wasted no time in confronting my mother about the information she had sent me. She didn't deny any of it. She flat out admitted that they had all conspired in one way or another, siphoning off the inheritance my father had intended for me, and she brazenly asserted that she shouldn't have to pay it back because she had spent some of it on my upbringing. That made my blood boil. She robbed me of educational opportunities and a comfortable life that my father fought to preserve for me, all while claiming it was partially used for my care. And now she has the nerve to say she shouldn't be held responsible for returning it. Overwhelmed by the audacity, I told the mediator I believed both my mother and every grandparent involved were obligated to return every cent. It wasn't just a moral issue, it was a legal one. My father's intentions were crystal clear in the documents. He wanted me to be supported throughout my education and young adulthood. Instead, they greedily split up what was rightfully mine. My lawyer and my friend's father shared my anger. They reassured me that actions like these, while not completely unheard of, were still profoundly immoral and possibly criminal. They vowed not to let me suffer in silence. If I'd had the full inheritance from the moment my father died, my life would have been drastically different. I'd have never had to struggle or work so relentlessly just to scrape together funds for school. My entire life could have been filled with fewer anxieties, and now I'm left with no trust in my so-called family. This revelation made us realize that taking the gentle approach was pointless. We informed my mother that we would demand maximum restitution. We have scheduled another meeting, this time insisting that all grandparents, maternal and paternal, be present because they are complicit. Court proceedings may be inevitable if they don't cooperate. Meanwhile, I have decided to move forward by applying for a student loan for now, so at least my education won't be stalled. But I refuse to forfeit what is rightfully mine. I need that money to ensure I can stand on my own 2 feet, just as my father intended. Whether it takes a few months or even years, I won't rest until every last dollar is returned to me. I'm done letting these people use my inheritance to fund their own lives. Their promises, their illusions of having loved me, and their vile conspiracies have all fallen away, and I see them for who they truly are. They shattered my ability to believe in familial bonds. My final stance is this: I want my father's wishes honored, and I demand accountability from every single person who betrayed him, and by extension, me. It is unfortunate that they have all failed to keep their promises to protect my well-being. Now, I don't think I ever want to lay eyes on any of them again. The heartbreak is enormous, but so is my resolve. And I won't be silenced or manipulated anymore.